Welcome to TrustTalk. In today's episode, we're discussing the importance of trust in lobbying with our guest, Peter van Keulen, a prominent lobbyist in the Netherlands. Peter emphasizes the importance of integrity and access in building trust with decision makers and the public. While regulations vary by country, it's crucial to educate people about the diversity of actors involved in lobbying to combat stereotypes and foster trust. Building trust is an ongoing process that requires open communication and a commitment to ethical practices. Your host, Severin de Wit.
Peter, welcome to TrustTalk. You were a founder of Public Matters, one of the top advisory consultancy for public affairs and lobbying. What brought you to start Public Matters?
Well, thanks first of all, Severin, for having me on TrustTalk. It's a great pleasure and honor to be one of your guests. I started in 2001 with Public Matters, but my interest in politics started when I was 15. And that changed during my studies, public administration, into how policy is made, how is it developed, and how do people influence it to become it a real regulation. So I experienced that in practice in the House of Representatives, the Dutch second chamber. I saw how people were trying to influence members of parliament. Then I switched to an international consultancy firm in The Hague, Brussels and Washington. And specifically in Washington, I saw that influencing politicians or politics is a profession and you can make money with it. Then fast forward, there was one element missing in my experiences, and that was the entrepreneurial aspect of influencing politicians or politics. And that was the basis for the decision to start an agency where I experienced in Washington how to differentiate between the lobbyist at the time, the political consultants at the time, and how I founded Public Matters. In the old days, lobbyists were representing clients, companies, and taking their interests to politicians, and that's not the role I have as a consultant. I don't represent clients, but I support them when engaging with decision makers, and that is how I started in 2001.
Let's begin by clarifying the terms public affairs and lobbying, before delving into the role of trust in your work. While many listeners may have some familiarity with lobbying, the concept of public affairs may be less well understood. Help us clarify those terms.
Yeah, excellent question. And let's first agree that I don't want to make friends among the scientific community with the definitions I have with my profession. I keep it very concrete and practical.
But you are in the business of making friends.
Yeah, absolutely, but not specifically on scientific. And I don't want to lose myself in definitions. And many people look in a different way on what lobbying is, what public affairs is, and what stakeholder engagement is, because that is the three levels we distinguish in our profession. I distinguish three circles basically, and lobbying for me is in the heart of the definition, lobbying being the profession of influencing elected officials, politicians, members of parliament, municipality council or whatever. So that's the inner circle of definition, that is lobbying, reaching out and influencing politicians. Then the second circle around lobbying is the public affairs circle, in which you try and influence decision makers like civil servants working at ministries or in the province or wherever. And then the third circle covering lobbying and public affairs, that is what we call stakeholder engagement, where you indirectly try to influence scientists or NGOs or legislators and trying to convince them of a specific position with which they influence civil servants and or politicians.
Peter, it reminds me of the origin of the word lobbying. If I'm not mistaken, it was when Ulysses Grant and his ministers or whatever they were at the time stayed in the Willard Hotel in Washington, and the people in the lobby trying to get hold of these people, especially the president, of course, if they wanted to defend a certain situation. Is that the correct history?
Yeah, the famous Willard Hotel, literally where there was a lobby, where there are lobbies all over hotels in Washington and all over the world. But in the Willard Hotel, across the street of the White House, That's where the president stayed, but also members of the Senate and the House of Representatives. And that's where people trying to influence these decision makers, they just walked in the lobby and tried to convince them.
Peter, what do you believe is the fundamental relationship between trust and lobbying? And how can maintaining transparency and ethical practices help build and maintain trust among stakeholders? And what role does trust play in successful lobbying efforts?
Well, Severin, to me, there are two crucial cornerstones that define the relationship between lobbying and trust. On the one hand, that is the activity of lobbying, during which an exchange of information takes place between stakeholders, and the recipient of this information needs to be able to have full trust in, for example, the quality of information. The second cornerstone that defines the trust between lobbying and trust is related to the, let's say, the voice and face of the information that is exchanged. That is the person of the lobbyist as sender. He or she should be trusted as source of that information. To me, this trust in the personal relationship is even more important than the information itself. Related to transparency and ethical practices, to me, they are the means that define the context of trust. So being transparent, a lobbyist can demonstrate that he or she has nothing to hide and is committed to acting in the best interest of all stakeholders. And this explicitly excludes the common and societal interest and not self-interest. And doing so ethically, based on, for example, a code of conduct, the recipient can hold the lobbyist accountable for the way he or she operates. And let's be clear, becoming and maintaining a trusted influencer is an ongoing process to me that takes months or sometimes even years. It requires an ongoing effort and investment, and also requires to be available for a stakeholder when the information exchange is not directly related to self-interest. So trust plays, to me, a critical role in successful lobbying. When a lobbyist is trusted, stakeholders are more open to listen to his or her perspective in a way that they are also more open to take in new information and consider including it in the position one takes. To conclude, I must say that nowadays, in times of a polarized political and media climate, building that long-term relationship on trust is more challenging than ever. It's more time-consuming than before, and it demands more resources. And the upside is that once you are trusted, you have friends for life. And that means that as trusted lobbyists, and while embracing this credibility, I think your influence can be higher than ever.
How do you address the common perception that lobbying and public affairs work is often opaque and biased towards a particular interest? And what role does building trust play in your efforts to promote transparency and accountability in these fields?
Well, that's the dilemma of public affairs and lobbying, because it's a profession that usually takes place behind closed doors. And then people feel that deals are being made behind those closed doors. Well, I say it's just meetings where you inform your stakeholders about specific positions. But the fact that it's taking place behind closed door, which makes sense. Lawyers do their work behind closed doors, accountants do so, journalists often do that. But with decision making and influencing is also a word what people don't like, or people don't like to be influenced, that doesn't help building a better reputation for our profession.
You mentioned transparency. It's a critical aspect of lobbying. According to the OECD report, Lobbying in the 21st Century, there are two other essential elements for building trust in lobbying, namely integrity and access. Could you discuss these terms and explain their significance in fostering trustworthy lobbying practices?
So integrity and access, excellent elements of how essentially these two things are for my profession. Integrity is something you do and you show. You show it by having a code of conduct in place, for example, where we tell our clients how we operate and how we protect their interest. but also the way you act towards the people you're trying to influence. So integrity, very important, showing it and doing it. Access is a more sensitive topic for lobbyists because working in a decision-making environment, you know people, and that means that you have access to them. And also the fact that people rotate in different political functions or as a civil servant, you know a lot of people. But it doesn't mean automatically that when you know them and you have access to them, that they will do whatever you like. So you need to be carefully taking care of those relationships, and the fact that you know somebody doesn't mean automatically that you can change his position.
In the United States, the Lobbying Disclosure Act of 1995 requires lobbyists to register and disclose certain information about their activities, including their clients and the issues they are advocating for or against. I don't think we have similar legislation in Holland or in Europe, do we?
No, we don't. And the history in the US is even older. Late 19th century, they already had regulation in place for US lobbyists, but also especially for foreign governments lobbying in Washington. And in 1946, the first law with sanctions was in place in Washington. And Europe as a decision-making concept, of course, developed itself later. And there the discussion about regulation started somewhere in the mid-90s. And there's some regulation in Brussels in place where you need to register, where there's a transparency register. So there is some regulation in place in Brussels and also in the member states. But in the Netherlands, I must admit that we have been rather late of introducing regulation. And there's some now. So when you are active in the House of Representatives, when you are lobbying members of parliament in the House, then some lobbyists register and they get an exit pass. Or members of parliament need to register their gifts, but it's rather soft and not very sanctioned. And I think also for the reputation of lobbyists and also for the reputation of politicians, it makes sense to regulate our industry a little bit more than we currently do.
Which brings me to a question about the European Commission. If I'm not mistaken, there is a recent trend that they want former commissioners or other high professionals from the European Commission to be subject to rules where it is basically forbidden for them to act as a lobbyist for a particular party within a certain period of time. Is that correct? And if so, what do you think of that?
Well, these regulations are in place for some years now. That's what we call in our profession the revolving doors, where a politician one day are a politician or a member of the European Commission, and the other day change to the other side and become expensive consultants and do all kinds of interesting peddling. And there was a recent case where a Dutch European Commissioner, Mrs. Kroes, was mentioned in this respect, where she was supporting Uber, and it's all over the news, so I can share that, I think, where she was accused of mixing those roles, and when stopping as European commissioners, switched too soon over to the other side. So I think it's very good to have these regulations in place, and also good that it's being sanctioned. Especially also, we had the recent affair in the European Parliament, where there was some discussions of members of the European Parliament were getting financial gifts from specific governmental countries, which had nothing to do with lobbying. That's bribery, but also in the Parliament there's discussion on what can they do, what kind of gifts can they accept, and how to register that. And I think that's good for trust in politicians, trust in the political system itself, and also when it's linked to lobbyists, I think it's good for the reputation or the trust that people have in lobbyists as well.
In a recent article you wrote on LinkedIn, it seems that there are still some ingrained stereotypes about lobbying that can be misleading. For instance, it is commonly assumed that only companies and consultants engage in lobbying activities, while NGOs and government lobbyists also play a significant role. Could you tell us more about the variety of actors involving in lobbying and how these stereotypes impact the perception of lobbying as a whole?
Yeah, excellent point. And it's an issue that is bothering me for quite some years now, because you're fully right. People think that only companies with a lot of money can influence politicians, and the contrary is the case. You see a lot of competition between lobbyists from companies, yes, but also from NGOs in the environmental industry or governments. The biggest growth of lobbyists in the Netherlands was from lobbyists on a municipality or regional decision-making level. So governments, municipality or province, influencing members of the House of Representatives, that's where the biggest growth has been. And that sounds a little bit strange, but for me it's a confirmation that lobbying or public affairs is a real profession. You need experts to do so, and that is what municipalities saw themselves as well. And also on a European level, where you saw the recent case where Germany, the German government, is now lobbying against specific regulation on the fuel directive, where the European Commission is electrifying cars within 10 to 15 years, and the German government is now lobbying against that regulation, and also that is perceived as lobbying. It's a bothering thing for me that only multinationals or consultants are perceived as they have money so they can be a lobbyist. And I think that is something that the professional organizations should own and explain more on what lobbyists do, and that there's a high variety of lobbyists.
Do you have an example of an NGO that's lobbying?
Yes, many are lobbying, like Greenpeace or Friends of the Earth. Recently, they are very professional lobbyists in The Hague, but also internationally, for forcing legislators coming up with more sustainable legislation, but also forcing companies to become more sustainable themselves. And they do so through legislation, but they also do that through taking legal actions and challenging companies through legal ways.
It seems that the discussion around lobbying regulations often focuses on what we just mentioned, the stereotypes, and lacks a deeper understanding of how lobbyists can transparently and effectively improve policy making. In publications, you criticize the lack of clear definition of lobbying. I think you mentioned that in the beginning of our conversation, which can lead to biased equations in lobbying laws and regulations. Can you talk a little bit more on how policymakers and the media can better understand and approach lobbying, and what changes could be made to current lobbying regulations to make them more effective and reflective of the diverse actors involved in lobbying?
Basically, to me, this question comes down to a lobby for lobbyists. So how can we, as public affairs professionals, better explain what we do? And by that also becoming a more trustworthy professionals in the way how we operate. It's, for me, very basic. Explain more what we do. Be more open on what we do. And that doesn't mean, for me personally, explaining for who I do my work, but explain more what you do, how the system works, what your added value is to the quality of decision making, how you add information to the decision making process, and in that way trying to make policy a little bit better. And I think by explaining that more and more, being more transparent about it, I think that would improve the reputation of my profession.
We mentioned that already a little bit, but maybe let's go deeper into that. Your perspective on the ongoing discussion in the Netherlands regarding lobbying legislation and introduction of a lobby register. You just mentioned for what clients you act, for example. At the moment, I don't think there is an obligation for any lobbyist or public affairs professional to tell us who you're actually acting for.
There's no regulation to do so, and I am happy that there is none, because there's some discrepancy between the relationship or the role you have with your clients. So I feel comfortable with the fact that there's no regulation for that, and that's on the sending end. But on the receiving end, however, so when you talk to politicians or civil servants, I believe that there should be more regulation in place, where there's some regulation now that ministers, for example, need to open up their agenda and register in a public register on who they meet and who they talk to. But they're not all compliant with sticking to that regulation. So one minister is, some aren't. And also on the chamber side, on the House of Representatives side, there's no obligation to register meetings. And I think that would make sense without saying that a register solves everything, because for me a register is instrumental on being more transparent on the profession of lobbying. But I think making it more transparent and using a register for that makes sense to me.
I came across a 2013 report by Burson Marsteller titled A Guide to Effective Lobbying, which stated that decision makers in the Netherlands found industry meetings to be most helpful in making informed decisions. It has been 10 years since the report was published. Do you perceive any changes in the effectiveness of industry meetings or other lobbying tactics in helping decision makers make informed decisions in the Netherlands?
What you see is the principle for an effective lobby is cooperation. So industry meetings, to me, how I see the report, is that several companies were working together as one front, trying to influence or take a position on specific issues. That principle still stands. However, you see much more individual companies representing themselves without cooperating with others. So I think in that respect, companies could be more cooperative with, for example, their industry associations or with the employers association, VNO, NCW, or with others, collectively representing their interests. And I think that is done less and less, and you see more individual companies representing themselves. In addition, what you see as a trend in my profession now is that not only companies from the same industry work together, but you see also, so more in horizontal cooperation, you also see vertical coalitions where companies work with other industries or with NGOs, and that compared to 10 years ago is much more effective now. And see on ad hoc issues where you can cooperate with others and organize a front on one issue or one policy topic, and that's, I think, the way to do it. Not only do it from a single industry, but work together with others. Well, another example, Severin, is, for example, now the discussion we have in the Netherlands on legislation that should decrease the nitrogen emissions. Where in the past you saw the farmers' associations operating individually, and now they work closely together with the producers of food for animals, or not only the cow associations, but also the pigs association and the chickens organization. They all work together on a high and professional way, opposing the way our government is introducing that nitrogen legislation, which has a high impact on that industry. However, what I also see is that the way they do it creates more and more polarization, also because the other side, so to speak, so the environmental organizations or specific cabinet parties, they oppose the way the farmers represent their interest. But this, I think, matches to your question, industry meetings, how important is that? This is the example these days now where you see the farmers working very closely and I think effectively together.
Concluding our interview about trust, I ask every person I interview the following question, so also to you. Looking ahead to the foreseeable future, what do you consider to be the primary obstacles for public affairs professionals and lobbyists in building trust with the public?
Well, I don't talk about obstacles, of course. Lobbying is also a semantic discussion, so I'd rather talk about challenges. What are our challenges, if that's okay?
Of course. No crisis and no obstacles, but challenges.
Yeah, for us it's challenges, and that starts with the responsibility and doing three things. Explain what we do with our profession. Be open about what we do in our profession, and also the most important thing is, the best English word I could find is frapper toujours. Repeat what you do, comply with regulation, and explain and be open to what you do, and do that and explain that and be open every day and do that in a consistent way. And by that I hope the understanding about my profession gets a little bit higher, but also the trust people have in lobbyists becomes a little bit better.
Peter, thank you very much for being available today for TrustTalk podcast, and I wish you lots of success in your work as one of our top consultants in the Netherlands on public affairs.
Thanks, Severin. It was great to be a guest, and always a pleasure to listen to the podcast and even to be a guest on it. Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of Trust Talk. We hope that you found the conversation valuable and informative. At Trust Talk, we believe in the power of trust to create positive change in the world. If you believe in our mission, we would greatly appreciate your support. You can help keep Trust Talk going by making a donation on our website at trusttalk.co/donate. Every contribution, no matter how small, helps us to continue bringing you thoughtful and engaging podcasts. Thank you for your support and for listening to Trust Talk. We look forward to meeting you again for future episodes.